That moment, that tiny contradiction, is the story of the modern economy. Because here's the uncomfortable truth: most people are never told directly. Governments don't just tolerate inflation. They often quietly prefer it. Not because they hate you. Not because there's a secret room of villains planning suffering. But because inflation solves political problems that honesty cannot. And once you see the logic, you can't unsee it. It matters right now because the world is sitting on more debt than at any point in human history. Households, corporations, governments, everyone owes someone something. And the system only works if the burden never feels unbearable. So policymakers have two options. One is painful and visible. The other is quiet and deniable. Guess which one gets chosen? To understand why, you have to start with a simple idea. Debt is a promise made in today's dollars. But it's paid back with tomorrow's dollars. And tomorrow's dollars are not the same. Imagine you borrow 100,000 units of currency to build a highway, a hospital, or just to keep the lights on. If prices stay flat, that debt stays heavy. Every unit you repay feels just as painful as the first. But if inflation runs at 5% a year, the real weight of that debt shrinks quietly. The number stays the same. The burden does not. Nothing has been forgiven. No vote was taken. No announcement was made. The debt just slowly dissolves in real terms. It's like telling the public you'll never raise their taxes, while quietly shrinking the purchasing power of their wages. And politically, that's gold. Because reform is visible. Reform creates enemies. Reform has names, dates, headlines, protests. Cut spending, someone loses benefits. Raise taxes, someone loses income. Restructure pensions, someone loses security. Deregulate, someone loses protection. Reform is loud. Inflation is soft. You don't need to announce it. You don't need to vote on it. You just let it happen, manage the messaging, and wait. The system does the work for you. This isn't conspiracy. It's incentives. Take a step back. Modern governments run on borrowing. Not occasionally. Structurally. Budgets are designed with deficits baked in. Debt is rolled over year after year. Old bonds paid with new bonds. The entire machine assumes continuous trust and continuous growth. Now add voters. Voters want services. Healthcare. Infrastructure. Security. Education. Stability. They also want low taxes. They also want affordable prices. They also want rising wages. These goals contradict each other. Mathematically. So governments are forced into a balancing act. And inflation becomes the most flexible tool on the table. Because inflation spreads the cost across everyone. Quietly. Unevenly. Without a single line item labeled pain. Instead of telling you, we are reducing the real value of your savings by 3% this year. They say, supply chains are normalizing. Or, we're seeing transitory pressures. Or, we expect moderation in the coming quarters. Different words. Same outcome. The strange part is how long this strategy has been used. After major wars, governments often faced enormous debt. World War I. World War II. Financial crises. Pandemics. They had two choices. Admit the cost directly through austerity and reform. Or let inflation gradually erode the real burden. History shows what they usually chose. In the 1940s and 1950s, many countries ran inflation higher than interest rates on purpose. Not publicly announced. Not branded as policy. But quietly engineered. Economists later gave it a polite name. Financial repression. The effect was simple. Savers lost purchasing power. Debtors benefited. Governments The biggest debtors of all benefited the most. And here's the uncomfortable math. If a government owes trillions, even modest inflation saves them enormous real value. A 5% inflation rate sustained over several years can reduce the real burden of debt by tens of percent. Without passing a single reform. Without cutting a single program. Without admitting anything directly. It's not dramatic. It's not explosive. It's slow erosion. Like rust. Now look at the modern narrative. You're told inflation is an accident, a surprise, a temporary side effect, a policy mistake that no one intended. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it is. Because policymakers are constantly trapped between two dangers. Too little inflation, and debt becomes harder to manage. Too much inflation, and public trust begins to break. So they walk a narrow path. They aim not for zero inflation, but for acceptable inflation. 2%, 3%, sometimes more. Notice something strange. They never target zero. Zero would protect savers. Zero would preserve purchasing power. Zero would force structural reform. Zero would also make debt much harder to sustain. And that's the part that rarely gets said out loud. The public story says inflation is a monster to be fought. The internal reality is more complicated. Inflation is a monster, but also a tool. And tools get used. There's another layer that makes this even more uncomfortable. Inflation does not hit everyone equally. If you own assets, property, stocks, businesses, inflation often helps you. Asset prices tend to rise. Debts shrink in real terms. Leverage becomes powerful. If you rely primarily on wages and savings, inflation hurts you. Wages lag. Savings lose value. Costs rise immediately. Same inflation. Different realities. So when policymakers choose tolerance for inflation over hard reform, they are also making a distribution decision. Not officially. Not explicitly. But effectively. And that decision shapes who wins and who quietly falls behind. This is where the contrast between public hype and underlying reality becomes almost theatrical. Publicly, inflation is framed as an external shock, a surprise caused by energy prices, or shipping delays, or unpredictable events. Behind the scenes, many governments are quietly relieved when inflation runs a bit higher than expected. Because it gives them breathing room. Because it makes debt ratios look better. Because it delays painful decisions. They can hold press conferences saying inflation is under control while privately benefiting from its existence. It's not hypocrisy in the emotional sense. It's structural incentive. The system rewards avoidance of short-term pain. It punishes honesty when honesty creates immediate backlash. So inflation becomes the compromise. Not because it's good, but because it's easier than reform. Now zoom out. The long-term consequences of this logic are not abstract. They are already visible. Public trust weakens. People stop believing official numbers. Savers change behavior. Speculation increases. Asset bubbles grow. Inequality widens. When people feel the system is quietly rigged against them, they stop engaging constructively. They take shortcuts. They seek risk. They look for escape routes. This is how financial fragility builds slowly. Not through collapse, but through erosion. And the irony is sharp. Inflation is often justified as a way to protect stability. But over long periods, it undermines the very trust stability depends on. Governments become trapped. They rely on inflation to manage debt. But the more they rely on it, the less credibility they have. The less credibility they have, the harder it becomes to control inflation when it actually matters. It's a loop. A quiet one. A dangerous one. You can already see the early symptoms. People chasing risk not because they're greedy, but because safety no longer feels safe. Savings accounts losing real value. Pensions under pressure. Younger generations assuming ownership is impossible. Older generations quietly watching purchasing power fade. And every time, the official language remains careful. Optimistic. Calibrated. Soft landing. Transitory pressures. Normalization. Resilience. Words that sound stable. Used to describe a system, leaning heavily on a tool that slowly corrodes confidence. This doesn't mean reform is easy. It is. Real reform requires admitting trade-offs, nomming losers, explaining costs, losing elections. Inflation allows leaders to avoid that confrontation, at least temporarily. And that is the strange logic. Not evil, not heroic, just incentives playing out predictably. Short-term survival over long-term health. Political continuity over structural honesty. Comfortable narratives over uncomfortable math. Which leaves one question hanging in the air.